And I had become very interested in the evidence to justify lockdown, social distancing, and masks, and the evidence wasn't there.
Okay, well, I have Dennis Modry here on the Carla Rand Show. And Dennis, I'm really happy to talk to you. We tried to connect a couple of times and we finally made it happen. And I really wanted to persevere because I really wanted to have this conversation. So thank you so much for being on here with me, Dennis. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you, Dennis, and why are you here?
Well, that's a good question. I guess you could answer the question why I'm here, but a little bit about myself is that my career was as that of a cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon. I'm the one who started Western Canada's first heart and lung transplant program, and I directed the transplant program as well as the cardiovascular intensive care unit for the majority of my 30 years in practice. Throughout that time, I also did a few other things. I had 4 children, and I was involved with business in certain respects. Was the president and chairman of president, CEO, and then chairman of a company called CPRO, which is still in existence. I was on the board of Brianna Biotech, and I was the chair of the audit committee for Imperial Equities for about 10 years. But politically, I've been involved behind the scenes since I came back from Stanford in 1984. I became involved with the Getty government on the finance committee, and then the Klein government, and then for a brief period with the Stelmach government. And so I've had a fair amount of political input behind the scenes. And since my retirement in January of 2016, I thought things were going along reasonably well until I found out that my freedoms and rights were becoming fairly restricted. And I thought that maybe I would weigh in on that to some extent. And so, because I've known Jason Kenney for quite some time, when he was the president of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we used to have lunch together. And when he came back from Ottawa, and wanted to be the leader of the United Conservative Party, I had lunch with him at the Mark here in Edmonton and shared with him some information. And then subsequent to being selected as the leader, met with him again with respect to healthcare. And so with the implementation of the first implementation of the restrictions in Alberta by the UCP government, we were all concerned in the beginning because we didn't really know what to expect. But by the late spring in May or June, it became evident that the lockdowns were causing more harm than good. And the premier at that point actually came out and publicly stated that he apologized basically and acknowledged that there was more harm than good. But then it became evident in the fall of 2020 that he was intending, I think by November, he was intending on implementing another lockdown. And so I called him on his cell. He didn't answer. I emailed him on his private email line. He didn't answer. I tried multiple times, called the office, didn't get a call back. And so I thought, well, okay, he's just going to carry on embarking with another lockdown. And I had become very interested in the evidence to justify lockdown, social distancing, and masks. And the evidence wasn't there. And then when the Great Barrington Declaration came out in October 4th of 2020, I reviewed that plus other scientific information and drafted an open letter to him, which I sent on December the 11th. And then from there, and I provided for him all of the evidence with the links to that evidence that he could have easily looked at to not proceed with the second lockdown, which occurred in late December of 2020. And then I did get a response from him in March the 11th, exactly 3 months later. And it was interesting because he wasn't able to provide any justification for lockdown, social distancing, or masks to counter the evidence that I had provided for him. But he did point out one thing, and that one thing was that the lockdowns were justified to prevent, and the mask and social distancing to prevent overwhelming of the healthcare system. Now, the problem with that was if you back up 6 months or 7 months, he also stated that we can ramp up the ICU beds to 1,081, and that's where the rubber meets the road. We had 272 fully funded beds, and for him to ramp up to 1,081 would have been very easy to do, except to say that there would be a staffing shortfall, but that could have been overcome. Now, subsequently, as you know, he's implemented 2 more lockdowns. So, you know, it obviously is an international problem. It's not just a local problem. But from a local perspective, he could have been a hero. Literally, he could have solved 2 problems with 1 move. And the 2 problems I'm talking about was the ability to manage a surge of COVID-19 patients, and second, to solve the problem of access to the healthcare system if he had simply increased the number of ICU beds, which he did not do. But that would have solved 2 problems. So in my opinion, that's a failure of leadership. It's also a failure of leadership when you are unwilling to look at the evidence to counter the conventional narrative. So let's look at that very briefly. As you are aware, Alberta Health Services, Dina Hinshaw, have been sued, and the delays in the court proceedings has to do with the fact that Alberta Health Services keeps requesting a delay. And the reason they do is because they are unable to provide the evidence justifying the lockdowns. So by virtue of that failure, the delays keep carrying on to the point where they're hoping they can find some evidence to justify the lockdowns, particularly lockdowns in the context of trying to defend the lockdowns based on preventing deaths from COVID-19 when the lockdowns themselves have caused more deaths than COVID-19. And that brings up one other point. It'll be the last point I'll make about COVID-19, and that is the issue of the diagnosis based on the PCR test. And the PCR test was never designed to diagnose COVID-19 or any other disease for that matter. And you take a tiny fragment of a viral particle and you amplify it enough times so that you can identify an amino acid sequence. Well, the problem with that is that if you take all of the coronaviruses, 82% of them have a common structure, a common amino acid sequence structure. And therefore, when you have a tiny fragment and you amplify it, and you get to a point where you can say, oh, well, that's part of a coronavirus, it must be COVID-19. That isn't, that we know categorically that when you have cycle thresholds over 30, that it's inaccurate, it's not reliable at all. And they've been running cycle thresholds from 35 to 47, like most centers around the world. So the whole issue of defining a case based on a PCR test when somebody's perfectly healthy and well is erroneous to the nth degree. So building off of that, but even before that, I figured that it was time for me to try and change the system. And so that's one of the things that I'm fundamentally focused on right now, because I don't see the political system right now working to protect Alberta's interests, their prosperity, and their health by this government. And given what's occurring around the world, sort of this Marxist socialist envelope or Marxist socialist movement that's enveloping us, I think Alberta has a real opportunity to be the tip of the spear to burst that bubble. So I've spoken probably now for 10 minutes, and I've probably given you some ammunition for questions. So why don't I answer some questions?
No, that's great. I really appreciate that, Dennis. And I've heard that from other doctors too about the PCR tests. A lot of the doctors that, that study this kind of thing are saying, these are not accurate tests. Why are they using these tests? It doesn't make any sense.
Correct.
So, and then there's a lot of other things that you said. What do you feel like you're getting the most pushback on, Dennis? Like when you state the facts, what do you feel like comes up the most?
In terms of pushback with respect to what, COVID?
Yeah, let's say the mandates. Like for you to say, you know what, these mandates need to end, because I very much agree with that. Why are they not ending? What's the biggest reason? Is it the ICU beds then?
Well, no, I think you need to look at it from a broader international perspective. There is a tremendous amount of money that is involved with the pharmaceutical, medical, political, industrial complex, if you will. And, when you look at it from the point of view that there's a lot of money to be made here, and you look at it from the point of view that seasonal flu vaccine rates have been going down and down, this has been disturbing for the pharmaceutical companies because they're not, in their view, they're not making the kind of money that they should be making. So one of the problems that we're seeing why there's not the kind of pushback against what is occurring that we would like to see is because it's simply because there is money that is being paid to physicians, scientists, even, for example, the Nobel Prize laureate in Edmonton, who's a virologist, Dr. Houghton. And so when he comes out with an article in support of the vaccinations, you have to ask yourself the question, is he being paid by the pharmaceutical industry? Well, of course he is. And the media is being funded indirectly as well. And are politicians being funded indirectly as well or directly? I don't know, but there certainly is suspicion along that line. But with respect to physicians in particular, because generally the public has trusted physicians to be honest, truthful, working on behalf of their health. Well, they are being silenced by virtue of the threat of losing their privileges or losing their medical license. So you're not getting pushback there. But where we are seeing pushback is by people such as Robert Malone, for example, who developed the mRNA technology, who's come out totally against vaccinations. People like, I'm blocking on his name right now, Michael Yeadon, who was the chief scientist for Pfizer, he's come out against it. Peter McCullough, who's the editor of two prestigious journals in the US out of Texas, he's adamantly against it, Jay Bhattacharya, et cetera. So there's pushback at that level. There's also pushback now occurring in the Ontario legislature by MLAs, and I expect we might see some of that here in Edmonton. If you saw the recent reports out of Poland and Greece, where the public literally stormed the legislatures and were pummeling the MLAs or their members of parliament, the world is starting to push back. There was a recent case out of the UK, I think it was published today or yesterday, that I think is quite important, and that is a physician who lost his license for speaking out. The High Court in England has ruled that his license must be restored. So these are the kinds of things that are happening and will continue to happen, notwithstanding the class action international litigation that is occurring as well against the pharmaceutical industry, the World Health Organization, the CDC, and certain governments as well, particularly in Canada and the US, because Canada and the US have the best and the most robust class action laws on the books. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you,
Next
Dennis.
question.
Yeah. Okay. So how do we get out of this? Because when I look at it, where we've come, I realize it's come from like a very left-wing policies just infiltrating throughout the government, and there seems to be corruption. There seems to be a lot going on. So how did we get here, Dennis? We've obviously given up a lot of ground already. The government has a lot of control over everything, right? Where we get our business license, insurance, insuring our vehicles, all of that. So obviously there's been a shift. So how did we get here? And then, Dennis, what is your take on how do we get out of this?
Well, certainly we got here because, the government, and there's a lot of good people in government, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good people in government, but they've heard a single narrative with respect to COVID-19 recommendations for its control. And they bought into that Kool-Aid, and that narrative has come out to the public in a way in which there has been so much harm that's been done already, and there's so many people's lives who have been restricted and continue to be restricted. How does a government then go back and say, we made a mistake? How does that look to the public if the government says, all the harm that we've caused, we shouldn't have done? We weren't smart enough to listen to a counter narrative. How do they get out of that jam? Not easily in the eyes of the public. Much of the public, though, as you know, has bought into the narrative. They've been vaccinated, and they're facing now boosters, and it might be multiple boosters. And so how do they get out of it, I think, is a very difficult task, and it becomes political as well. And once the public becomes better educated regarding the harms from the mandates to deal with COVID-19, there will be even greater pushback. And it's unlikely that any government that has been untruthful and has been unwilling to look at the evidence provided from the other perspective, which is their responsibility to do, the public will turn against that government. And one of the things, when you ask now, what is the solution? Well, that is a solution that we've been working on with respect to the Alberta Unity Project. The Alberta Unity Project, in essence, is an inspiring initiative to unite all Albertans, businesses, and organizations to actually protect their interests, their prosperity, their freedoms and rights by enabling Alberta to chart a new path forward. And that new path forward, in our opinion, in terms of the leadership of the Alberta Unity Project, is independence. Now, not everybody is on board with respect to the idea of Alberta independence, but independence doesn't have to be a frightening term for Alberta. We know from a mainstream research poll that was reported on October the 19th in the Journal and in the Western Standard, and maybe other media as well, that 47% of decided voters in that poll were already in favor of independence. And when you look at the oppressive policies of the federal government, and you understand that the federal government wants to end our oil and gas industry by 2030, and you recognize that Jack Mintz, who's advised many governments, who's the chair of public policy at the University of Calgary, when he has said that by ending the oil and gas industry in Alberta, all Albertans' quality of life and standard of living will drop by at least 1/3. It makes you stand up and pay attention to your own circumstances and your own future. And when you realize that if you want to change the circumstances for Alberta within Confederation, but you understand that if you look at that through the lens of history, the structural imbalance in Canada, as well as the challenges to change the Constitution, you recognize that in the last 116 years, no federal or provincial government has ever protected Alberta's interests or ensured its future prosperity. Similarly, you can't fix Alberta when you understand the structural imbalance, that is the lack of representation by population. As you probably are aware, and many of your listeners would be aware, that Alberta or Prince Edward Island elects one MP for one member of parliament federally for every 40,000 population. Alberta gets to elect one for every 130,000 population. So how does Alberta have influence at the level of the federal government? It doesn't. And it means that every election will be decided by Ontario and Quebec, because that's the voter-rich regions, and Alberta's voter-poor. And it doesn't matter the federal government that's in power, because they will always pander to the wishes of Ontario and Quebec at the expense of Alberta. And then finally, if you really want to fix Alberta's circumstances within Confederation, you've got the 5 hurdles of the Constitution to overcome, which, in my opinion, is completely impossible. It's just you cannot get by those 5 hurdles to change because that's what you'd have to do. You have to change the Constitution to benefit Alberta. For example, to end equalization, or to end any other equalization or any other egregious program that harms Alberta's interests. So it's an impossible challenge within Confederation, but Alberta, because of its abundance of natural resources, the work ethic, the can-do spirit, the entrepreneurialism in Alberta really has the ability to chart a new path forward if it simply has the courage to embrace independence, particularly independence from Canada. And the Alberta Unity Project is designed to achieve that objective. So to put it in sharp focus now, how to do that, you need to understand the 3.5% rule. The 3.5% rule was coined by Erica Chenoweth from Harvard. And she pointed out that 3.5% of a population can change the direction of that society. When Jason Kenney and UCP were elected, they had 3.5% of the voters as members of the UCP. That was 120,000 members. More people voted for the UCP, but that's because members have 4 or 5 people usually who are friends or colleagues that have a similar mindset. The UCP right now has around 10 or 12,000 members, so it's unlikely they're going to win the next election. The Alberta Unity Project's intention is to grow the membership to somewhere in the order of 500,000 members. And we have a strategy and a plan that's already started to be rolled out to achieve just that objective. So with 500,000 members within the Alberta Unity Project, we have the ability to not only influence the outcome of the election, but we also have the ability, or the members, if you will, have the ability to move to an independence-focused party. UCP could become an independence-focused party. The Independence Party of Alberta, or TIP, or WIPA, or the Alberta Advantage Party, any one of these, or the Buffalo Party of Alberta, any one of these could become the independence party that could win the election if all 500,000 members of the Alberta Unity Project move in that direction. The project itself will always be a project. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization designed to educate, inform, and inspire Albertans on the rationale and the merits of independence, how we will make it happen, and how we will assuage the concerns that some people may have regarding independence, such as splitting the vote or pensions or being landlocked or that sort of thing. So we've thought through every detail on this, and we're rolling it out, and it's impressive to see how many people are showing up at the venues. In Drayton Valley recently, we had somewhere around 800 or 900 people show up, standing room only. It was pretty impressive. And there's many other venues. We're virtually inundated with requests for presentations throughout the province. So I'm encouraged, I'm enthused, I'm excited about the prospects for Alberta. You know, I would say that we're in a fight to protect the values of Western civilization right now. And in a way, it's sort of a war. And, you know, when the adrenaline is flowing and you're faced with a challenge, you have two choices. You can run or you can stand up and fight. And, you know, our forefathers in 2 world wars stood up and fight. This is our time to stand up. And I'm a little older than you, Carla. But I rather suspect we may be linked at the hips when it comes to trying to come up with a plan, a strategy that can be executed to protect Alberta's interests and Alberta's prosperity and Alberta's freedoms and rights. So.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Dennis. I think for a lot of years, I know I've talked to some people that are, you know, probably your age and younger too, but, you know, especially the older generation, just saying, look, I keep hoping that somebody out in Ottawa will get elected that will actually give Alberta a fair shake. And it just doesn't happen. It just never seems to happen. And you're basically indicating why. Now, you mentioned 5 reasons why we can't change the Constitution. I believe you said 5. Could you share briefly what those reasons are? Like, why can't we change the Constitution so that Alberta can get a fair shake through the whole, like through Canada? And you're saying it's just impossible.
Well, you know, it's not just about it, actually is impossible. Okay, and here's why you can't change the Constitution. Now, this is not a specific reason, but I'll just give you an example. There were 2 attempts to change the Constitution previously. One was Meech Lake, and the other was the Charlottetown Accord. Both of those failed. But in any event, in order to change the Constitution, let's take ending equalization as a metaphor for ending any egregious program that adversely affects Alberta's interests, such as the development and transport of our natural resources, et cetera. So in order to change the Constitution, to open and change the Constitution, you would have to have a majority vote in the House of Commons. Then you would have to have a similar majority vote in the Senate to end equalization or any other egregious program. And then you would have to have 7 of 10 provincial legislatures representing 50% of the population. I repeat that. 7 of 10 provincial legislatures representing 50% of the population also would have to vote in favor of opening and changing the Constitution to benefit Alberta. Now, knowing that Quebec is the beneficiary of 2 of every $3 of equalization, what do you think the prospects are that Quebec would go along with it, much less the other six additional provinces? The 4th issue has to do with Quebec also believes that it has a veto. Even though Quebec never signed the Constitution, it has come out publicly and stated, we have a veto. And then finally is the issue of the Supreme Court. Constitutional challenges, which undoubtedly would occur as a result of ending equalization or any other egregious program, how are they decided? They are decided by the Supreme Court. How is the Supreme Court structured? Well, 3 justices are appointed from Ontario, 3 are appointed from Quebec, 1 from the Maritimes, and 2 from the West. So how do you think any constitutional challenge would be adjudicated by the Supreme Court? It sure wouldn't be in favor of Alberta. And here is the very best example to prove that. The approval by the Supreme Court of the CO2 carbon tax, the carbon tax. The Supreme Court literally had to twist itself into a pretzel in order to justify the carbon tax when the Constitution explicitly stated that the provinces have control over the development and transport of their natural resources. So it's bills like Bill C-69, which was the Environmental Protection Act, that usurped Alberta's control of the development and transport of its natural resources. But Bill 69 was overreaching regulation to prevent Alberta really from having that control that was promised within the Constitution. So you can see that we're in a dilemma. We are in a terrible dilemma right now within Confederation, and it's not just ending our oil and gas industry. It's also the ongoing loss of some $55 to $60 billion a year. I'll refer it better this way. Confiscatory federal tax policy means that we are federally taxed somewhere in the order of $55 to $60 billion a year, of which we get back roughly half of that. So think of what we could do with the rest of it. And then of course there's the other things like, is everybody happy with woke culture, cancel culture, rewriting history, critical race theory, the fact that you can't have a civil conversation with somebody if you disagree with them, then you're accused as being a racist. We see the writing on the wall. We see the trajectory that we are on. Even so much as this was astonishing to me, that the federal government is even floating the idea right now of limiting how far you can travel by automobile, train, or plane, and all in the name of climate change. Well, there hasn't been, in the last 100 years, there hasn't been one climate change apocalyptic prediction that has come true, not one. Yet we're hearing them all the time. So it's time really, for, your listeners to recognize that we need to get out of Dodge before it's too late. We haven't crossed the Rubicon yet, but it's coming. We have so much going for us in this province, and we need to be an example to the rest of the world as a beacon of light, as the most free, prosperous nation in which to live, work, raise a family, start a business. And we know how to do it. And on the website, albertaunity.org, are what we are recommending for an independence-focused government regarding policies, governance, bylaws, constituency association rules, etc. And there's a lot more detail there about the rationale for independence as well. So, you can tell I could go on for a long time.
And I would like to listen to you for a long time, but we do have to wrap it up right away. But Dennis, sure. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I think you're pointing out, it might sound I love how you're talking, because you're saying, look, yes, it's bleak. Yes, the West haven't been represented. Yes, the West are just getting pushed down, but there is hope. There are things that we can do. And that's very comforting, because I think a lot of people are very discouraged right now. And I really feel like COVID-19, it's really just the straw that broke the camel's back. I think everybody was getting frustrated. I think with this last election, when Justin Trudeau got in yet again, I think the West was just feeling very hopeless. And I think what's happening is it's almost like the government's getting enough rope to hang themselves. They're being so oppressive at this point. It's it's hard not to see it. If you actually do some research and look at the facts, it's hard not to see how wrong this is and how oppressed we actually are through this. And so, yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Any closing words, Dennis? Anything you'd like to add? I know you mentioned the website. Anything else you'd like to say, either about the Alberta Unity Project or whatever comes to your mind?
Well, what I would say is that just sort of reiterate what you've said, is that there is hope, and don't be discouraged. If you've got time, we're having rallies throughout the province in which we're sharing the message. And what I'd really like for your listeners to do is not just go to the website, but become a member. and help us. Volunteer if you wish. Because strategically speaking, what we are doing is setting up 87 educational chapters throughout the province. We'd like 100. We've set up 19 are pending right now. We're setting up 87, and we'd like 100 volunteers for each chapter. 100 volunteers is 8,700 volunteers. And if 8,700 volunteers just gets 57 members to join the Alberta Unity Project, we will be at 500,000 members, 500,000 members. And then we will control the outcome of the next election. So please help us, get involved, volunteer any way you would like to volunteer. And there's many things that people can do, and it's there on the website.
Okay. Appreciate that, Dennis. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for what you're doing, because we really need some leaders to step up and fight for us. I think that's the thing that's been so discouraging to me, Dennis, is just how the leaders, the government leaders, the political leaders, just the leaders all through our communities are just not standing up to this. And it seems like it's really just up to the people, because I don't know, you're very hard pressed to find anybody. But again, Dennis, like you pointed out with the doctors and stuff, their jobs are on the line. Right? So if they speak up about this, or if they don't get vaccinated, or if they don't follow the narrative, there's some pretty harsh consequences. So you can see why people are falling in line. But it is very discouraging to have somebody like you rising up and saying, hey, like, I'm here to support you, I'm here to help you, we have a plan, is very encouraging.
Well, here's one piece of encouraging information too. One of the very large hospital chains in the United States, as a consequence of the mandates for vaccinations, was unable to fully staff their hospital chain. So they have withdrawn the request for employees to be vaccinated. So this is going to carry on. This is going to carry on. So that's one piece of good news, just to show you. And it will happen here. And I don't know if it can happen with Mr. Kenney as the leader, and I'm not sure it can happen with respect to UCP, but I'm darn sure that it can happen with 500,000 members or more, make it 1 million members of the Alberta Unity Project. We will control the outcome of the next election.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thanks so much, Dennis. Really appreciate your time with this.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you for tuning into the podcast today. I absolutely love that you joined us. I love being able to record these, and I love our guests. It's been so much fun. So thank you. Please like it, share it, comment, do all of the things that you feel like you want to do if you enjoyed this podcast. I really, really appreciate that. And this podcast has been brought to you by my company, Power Fitness Online. So everything that we do locally with our workouts, with our group nutrition coaching, and with all of the other fun events and stuff that we run, we put all of that online. So now you can access everything, even if you're not locally, don't live in our area. So my coaches and I and all my staff, the whole team, we are putting so much work into these workouts. We're filming 5 fresh workouts every single week so that you never have to do the same workout twice. We're also doing group nutrition and personal nutrition coaching so that you get exactly what you need. And you know what the best part is? It's the community. The absolute best part is just knowing that you have the support, that you have the encouragement, that you have everything you need to succeed. So go to powerfitnessonline.com.